לא, זה לא יכול להיות. Very confusing. אם אתה אומר שרק מאישה אחת יורש.
So how is from
Then
the
how is gonna have from mother?
Okay. So Sorch Lions, you're the You ready? Whenever you're ready. Okay. Morning, everybody. Okay, we are on Gimel Amabet 3b. Just to, towards the end of the page, the Gemara had the question. We was talking about the hand of a person, and if a person stuck his hand out, something in his from private to public, and he had something in his hand, and the question was, can he bring his hand back into the place that originally was, that he's standing, let's say, in private, and it was filled with fruit, the Gemara says, and he brought it outside, can he bring it back in? And the Gemara brought two opinions. One opinion in the Braita says you're allowed to bring it back, and one opinion in the Braita says you're not allowed to bring it back. And the Gemara is trying to understand what is the reason, what is the case for these two rulings. Are these two rulings arguing with each other? One case, one Tana says you could bring the hand back. One Tana says you can't bring the hand back. And the Gemara was thinking maybe they're arguing whether we gave the hand the status of a Carmelite, a new domain. And if it's a Carmelite, you can't carry from a Carmelite to Carmelite. We said it's like a semi-private, semi-public place. You can't carry from that into public or into private. And then the Gemara wanted to move away from that, not to say that they're not arguing that. And the Gemara suggested maybe Nathan's answer, it depends if it's higher than 10 tvachim or lower than 10 tvachim, and everyone holds it. It would be a problem if we would give it a status of a Carmelite, but since it's higher than 10 tvachim, there's no problem. Lower than 10 tvachim, there'll be a problem. That was one answer to the Gemara. Then the Gemara says, no, maybe everyone holds it's not a Carmelite. We don't give it a special status. So what's the argument? The argument is, right, so the Gemara makes a distinction whether the hand was there before Shabbat or after Shabbat. You put a hand before Shabbat, you extended it, then we're going to be lenient. We'll allow you to bring it back in. We're not going to give you a fine. But if you put your hand out on Shabbat, we're going to give you a fine that you can't take it back. Because there's no I mean, we're talking about if the guy put his hand out unintentionally, so then there's no thing that's correct. The Gemara is going to get into the possibility maybe it was done intentionally, but until now we're talking about it was done unintentionally. Right. If he did it, if intentionally, if he put his hand in on Shabbat and he drops it, then it'll be mita really dead business, Mechala Shabbat, b'mezid, and warning he gets killed by the skila without witnesses he gets kareit, was done unintentionally being a korban chatat. So here then the Gemara says that one case it happened before Shabbat, like you said, and one case talking about when he did it on Shabbat itself. And the Gemara says, and if you're going to go ahead and we're going to give him a fine if you go with the head and he does it on Shabbat itself, because now then the Gemara is shut back. Shouldn't the opposite be true? The Gemara says, if he did it before Shabbat, if he put his hand out before Shabbat, if you'll give him a fine and you'll tell him you can't bring it back in, so he'll never come to the possibility of a korban chatat, of a sin offering. Why? Because since the first part of the act was done before Shabbat, so the akira was done before Shabbat. Even if he drops it outside on Shabbat, he's not chayiv a korban chatat sin offering for violating Shabbat unintentionally. when the guy put his hand out on Shabbat unintentionally, if you're going to forbade him to bring the hand back in, what might happen? He might drop it. If he drops it, then he actually did the kira on Shabbat, the uprooting on Shabbat, and the placing down on Shabbat unintentionally, and he would be chayav a korban. He'd be chayav a korban chatat.
Intention. There's this middle ground of, oh, look what I have in my hand. You know, I didn't know it was Shabbat. I didn't know I couldn't pick it up. Well, now we're going to warn you, but we're warning you only about half an act. We're not warning you about the completed act.
Okay, the Gemara didn't give that. Maybe the Gemara thought that the language of the Braita that'd be too much to add into the cases, because the language, one Braita says the guy went ahead and his hand was full with fruit and he brought it outside. One Braita said he's not allowed to bring it back in. Well, to add too many variables to the case, maybe the Gemara didn't feel that would be. If you want to say one was unintentionally, so that's not a big addition to the case. So one was before Shabbat, one was after Shabbat. You know, you those are more easier things to just say that the case is talking about. So the Gemara says, why aren't we concerned? The Gemara says, shouldn't the logic be the opposite? That if you go ahead and you fine him on Shabbat when he put his hand out on Shabbat unintentionally. No, I'm saying if you're gonna fine him on Shabbat, you're gonna tell him leave your hand out till after Shabbat. That will be the fine. If you're gonna, what's the knas? The knas is you're not allowed to bring. You're gonna impose this. What? You're gonna nullify. We'll call it a fine, a knas. What's the knas? It's not a financial knas. It's not a monetary penalty. It's a restriction. We're gonna give him we're gonna penalize him for stretching his hand out on Shabbat, and we're gonna not allow him to bring his hand back in. That's gonna be the penalty that we're going to give him. But the Gemara says, why aren't you worried about the fact that you might come to a biblical violation if you go ahead and give him that, impose that penalty on him, and you don't allow him to take his hand back? He might just drop it. And since he might drop it, and then he could come into the possibility of violating the Shabbat, the Torah level, to be chayav a korban chatat. But if he put his hand out before Shabbat, where he never could come to the korban chatat, maybe there you should give him this penalty. And the Gemara says, and why don't we do that? And the Gemara says, and since we don't do that, so the Gemara says, since we don't do that, we could answer a following question that we had. Tip showed the Rabbi Bar Abaye. We could answer, we said, what was the Rabbi Bar Abaye? What was his question? He said yesterday, if a guy went ahead and stuck bread into an oven, if a guy stuck bread into an oven on Shabbat, unintentionally, he stuck the bread in the oven unintentionally, and right, meaning what unintentional means he didn't know he couldn't bake on Shabbat, let's say, or he forgot that it was Shabbat. He thought, he didn't realize it was Shabbat already. He thought it was still weekday. And before it was baked, he remembered today is Shabbat. Now, we know there's a rabbinic prohibition to remove this dough that was attached to the wall of the oven on Shabbat. There's a rabbinic prohibition. Whether you put it in on Shabbat, whether you put it in before Shabbat, there's a rabbinic prohibition. Okay, well, sorry. There's a rabbinic prohibition before Shabbat. You put something in the oven. You want to go ahead on Shabbat to remove it from the oven. You can't. If you didn't, you have to take it out before Shabbat. You're not allowed to remove the dough that you put into the oven before Shabbat that's stuck onto that wall. Right. But here, what's the prohibition? Here, either the prohibition is just a weekday type of activity to scrape off this bread from the wall of the oven, Or the Rambam says the rabbis were concerned that maybe you might come to bake on Shabbat itself. If you go ahead and you allow a person to take out the bread from the oven on Shabbat, maybe he'll actually come to bake on Shabbat. So those are the two possibilities why you can't go ahead. It's a rabbinic issue. It's a rabbinic issue. That's a rabbinic issue. But now, being that that's true, there's a rabbinic prohibition to take out, to do this act on Shabbat. But what about of removing this dough that was placed before Shabbat? But what about if you place the dough on Shabbat? You placed it in on Shabbat, and you caught yourself before it baked. So if you catch yourself before it baked, you haven't yet reached the level of violating the Shabbat on a Torah level, unintentionally. Right. So there's definitely morning Morris. There's definitely a rabbinic prohibition that's being violated, Morris. If somebody puts if someone had dough in the oven, and on Shabbat it was stuck to the wall of the oven, and on Shabbat, by the way, if you want the English one. Today we're going to get the French. We'll get the French. Give a little base, 3B. There is a rabbinic prohibition to remove this dough from the walls of the oven. But the guy went ahead and he stuck, and on Shabbat, he by mistake placed this bread into the walls, and stuck this dough in the walls of the oven. And because he stuck the dough in the walls of the oven, he's now, if he leaves it there, what's going to happen? He's going to be violating the Shabbat. Because if he leaves the dough, if on Shabbat, on Friday night, a guy goes ahead and he sticks dough into the oven, not realizing it's Shabbat, if he leaves it there, what's going to happen, Morris? How long is it? A few minutes, it comes to bake in a few minutes. He violates the Torah prohibition. If he gets it out, if he takes it out right away, then he didn't violate the Torah prohibition because it never baked, right? Let's say if someone put a pot on a fire on Shabbat, what would you say if a person puts a pot, chas v'shalom, on a fire on Shabbat? You have someone, a friend of yours, comes to your house and he takes some water and he puts it in a tea kettle and he puts it on the fire on Shabbat. You take the pot off, right? You say take the pot off before it reaches boiling. So here the question is, the Gemara's question is, there is a rabbinic prohibition of removing this dough from the oven. There's a rabbinic prohibition. But do we say to protect the person from violating the Shabbat on a Torah level, will we allow him to remove this dough from the oven? Now, so the Gemara says, Hitirulo lerdota, did they go ahead and permit him to remove this bread from the oven and to take out the bread be pre-baked, and therefore he will call them before yovo lidei chiyuv chatat, before he should have a sin offering, or lo hatiru, or the rabbis did not allow him to remove this dough from the walls of the oven, even though if the rabbis will not allow him to remove the dough, there would be the biblical violation of Shabbat, even though it will be on a shogeg, on an unintentional violation, and he'll be obligated to bring a korban chatat, a sin offering, for violating the Shabbat unintentionally. So that was Rabbi Vi's question. Now, we have over here, in our case, when the guy placed let's look at the language of, when the guy placed the item in the oven on Shabbat, right? Or our case, when he stretched out his hand on Shabbat, right? And the Gemara said that what will be when he stretched out his hand on Shabbat? we're not going to allow him to put the hand back, right? Which will be a rabbinic, we're going to create a rabbinic prohibition of removing, we're going to give him a fine, a rabbinic prohibition, not to put his hand back with the fruit that's in his hand that he extended.
By telling him to remove his hand, you're creating a problem. And if he does, because it's unavoidable perhaps,
He was going to drop it down.
and then he's to you. But if you don't warn him, when he unavoidably, you tell him, hey, try not to drop it. If he does, then you haven't created this liability for him.
Right. So the Gemara is going to say, because if you tell him not to take the hand back, it might be very difficult for the guy, right? Morris, imagine the guy has fruit in his hand, and he stuck out his hand on Shabbat. Let's say Shabbat afternoon, Saturday afternoon, even if it's not Friday night, and you tell him because you stuck your hand now from private to public, you didn't put it down in public property. You hear Morris, we're going to say you can't put your hand, you can't pull it back in. We're going to give you a fine, but you should not have done it on Shabbat. You should not take food from your private domain and stick it out into public domain, because you're so close to violating the Shabbat. You're so close to putting it down in public domain, which will actually finish the job. So which would be a biblical violation. So we go ahead and we give you a fine. I would say, don't bring your hand back. Why are we? But you know what might happen as a result of that? If you don't bring your hand back, you might drop it, like Nathan says. You might say, I'm just going to put it down. I'm going to put it down. It's very hard for me to hold it out. And if I put it down, I'm going to come to what will happen? I will come to become an obligation of a chatat. You're setting me up by telling me not to pull the fruit back in. You're creating a scenario that there's a good chance I'm going to come to a biblical violation. Yet you want to you're ready to give me the fine, and you're ready to impose this rabbinic prohibition, even though might come at the cost of a biblical prohibition. So the Gemara is connecting the dots. So it seems that so too, if I went ahead and I stuck dough into the oven before, and now there's a rabbinic prohibition for me to remove there's a rabbinic prohibition to remove the dough from the oven, you're gonna keep that rabbinic prohibition, even if it comes at an expense of a biblical violation, because if you're going to keep that's what the Gemara is suggesting, right? And therefore, the Gemara is saying, so why don't tipshot the lo hitiru? Let us prove that the rabbis did not remove their rabbinic concern, even if as a result of not removing their rabbinic concern, having their rabbinic concern, it can lead to a biblical violation of Shabbat. So the Gemara says, "Halo kasha." That's not a question. You know what? V'tifshot. Let us actually come to that conclusion. The fact that the rabbis did not make the distinction between the guy putting his hand out before Shabbat and after Shabbat, and before Shabbat we'll give him the fine, and on Shabbat we won't give him the fine, because if he sticks his hand out on Shabbat with the fruit, we're afraid he's going to come to a biblical violation if you fine him. This answers the question, or BV's question. So the Gemara says, "V'tivshot." Yes, you can answer the question. Okay. So what's the Gemara saying, Morris, at this point? And Nathan, the Gemara is saying that if a person would go ahead and stick dough into the oven unintentionally on Shabbat, and before it was baked, the Gemara is saying we will not allow you to remove that dough, even though it was going to come to this biblical prohibition of violating the Shabbat of korban chatat unintentionally. Then the Gemara says, you know what? I have different ibayit ema. I could suggest a different way to explain the two different braitos, and it's not gonna, and we can't answer Abivi's question. What we have on the table is we're dealing with two concepts. One, we have two braitos. One says if you stuck your hand out with fruit, your hand was full of fruit, and let's say you were private property. Doesn't say exactly where you are, but this is what the Gemara is at the moment thinking. You're private property. You stick your hand out with, you have an apple in your hand. You stick it out, and you went over into public property with your hand. You didn't put it down. One bright that says you're not allowed to bring your hand back on Shabbat. One bright says you're allowed to bring your hand back. So the Gemara wants to understand how do we explain? Are they arguing with each other? These two sounds like they're arguing, or they're talking about two different cases. So now the Gemara says, we can't answer the question of BV because the Braita that allows you to pull your hand, warning Asaf, the Braita that allows you to pull your hand back with the apple in your hand on Shabbat into private property while it's extended, your hand is extended to public property. That's when you put your hand out to begin with, you didn't know it was Shabbat. It was unintentional. We all know when you do something unintentionally, it's different when you do it intentionally. We can be a little easier going on a guy who does something unintentional. I didn't know. I didn't know I couldn't do it. I didn't know it was Shabbat. Right? Very good. He has to be an intentional act. It was done unintentionally, and we'll be easy on the guy. It was never placed down in public property yet. So Bishogeg, but the Braita that forbids you to pull your hand back in, the Braita that says you can't pull your hand back in, you have to leave your hand extended, is talking about Mezid. When you went ahead and you intentionally took the apple and you stretched on Shabbat, you were standing in private property, and you took an apple and you extended it, that you are very close to violating the Shabbat on an act of death, or at least karet, if there's no witnesses, and warning, you intentionally took an apple, standing in private property, extended it to public property. You're so close. You're close to the fire. You might put it down. There we're going to impose a fine on you, and we're going to say you're not allowed to bring it back into private property. So that's what the Gemara says. B'shogeg lo k'surabanan. If he did it unintentionally, the rabbis will not give him a fine. But if he did it intentionally, the rabbis would give him a fine. Now, the Rashi and the commentators want to understand how, according to this answer of the Gemara, why aren't we able to explain the Rabivi's case, right? Rabivi's case was Bishogeg. Rabivi's case was he. Look at the last Rashi, the Rashi on the bottom. B'shogeg lo konsurabana. The case, if you did it unintentionally, you went ahead and you stuck out your hand unintentionally with the fruit, we say we're going to allow you to bring your hand back. So Rabbi lo tifshot mehacha lo leisuv lo lehetir. But the case of Rabbi V, which was a case of shogeg, because the question of Rabbi V was, are we going to allow the guy to remove the dough that was stuck in the wall? Could he remove it in order that he should not come to a chatat, a sin offering? Sin offering is only unintentional, right? So we seem to have unintentional case, good morning. And here we said by unintentionally sticking your hand out, we allow you to pull your hand back in. So the same way we allow you to pull your hand back in, so could we say we could learn Rabivi's case. Now, but if that, so could we learn an answer to Rabivi's case? What was Rabivi's concern? Rabivi's issue was, would you go ahead? Do you want to create a scenario to prevent the guy from violating the Shabbat? Right? Would we allow you to go ahead and take out the dough? The case was a guy stuck dough in the oven on Shabbat. On Shabbat unintentionally he stuck dough into the oven, and if he leaves it there, if you forbade him from removing that dough to come to bake, he remembered before it reached the stage of baking. So if you allow him to remove the dough, you're preventing him from that violating the Shabbat unintentionally. You'll prevent him from bringing a korban chatat, a sin offering. If you don't allow him, if you forbade him from taking out that dough, then he's gonna automatically be obligated a korban chatat, a sin offering, right? That was Bibi's question. We have a rabbinic law on the books to say you don't remove dough from the wall of an oven on Shabbat because some say it's a weekday type of activity to scrape off that dough from the oven. Morris, have you scraped off dough from the oven recently? I don't know. Not this week, but it's a pretty weekday type of activity that we scrape off dough from the oven. Or you might come to bake on Shabbat if you scrape off the dough. So do we make an allowance for you to remove that dough on Shabbat or not? And that's the question that would be to prevent. Right, that's the question.
What's the biblical prohibition? You're not doing
Bleeding the baking, unintentional baking on Shabbat is still a biblical prohibition that's violated non-intentionally, but it's a biblical. We're not. If you put it before Shabbat, you'll never be a biblical. There won't be a biblical prohibition issue, because if you put bread in before Shabbat, the act of the baking there might be rabbinic issues eventually on what you could do on Shabbat or not. There will not be a biblical prohibition because the only biblical prohibition regarding that bread would be the baking the bread on Shabbat, you doing an act of putting the bread on Shabbat.
Put it in after
on Shabbat.
Okay.
On Shabbat, unintentional. That's unintentional baking.
Yeah.
But he did it unintentionally. Would we allow him? But there's something on the books that say you can't remove something from the rabbinic prohibition. As they said, you can't remove the dough from the walls on Shabbat. But there's a biblical prohibition of baking something on Shabbat. So the question is, would we go ahead and allow him to do this rabbinic prohibition of removing the dough from the oven to prevent him from reaching a biblical prohibition of the baking? That was a Bibi's question.
The point of that being prohibition for dough placed on the walls prior to Shabbat?
Right. That rabbinic prohibition both applies to dough that was placed before Shabbat and dough that was placed. Let's say if a person placed it on, let's say a person placed it on a Shabbat at 11 o'clock in the morning, and then, I mean, really, he wouldn't be able to use that bread anyways, because you can't benefit from an act of Shabbat. But let's say he put it at 11 o'clock in the morning, and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's already baked. He can't remove that dough. There's a rabbinic prohibition to remove dough from the walls of the bread. Right. So, right. Yeah. Okay. If it's that long, right. But let's say he caught himself after it was baked. Well, let's like. So they say it's because it's a more of a week. Some say it's more of a weekday activity. It's more of a type of not a Shabbat type of activity. Just like some say why you can't drive bicycles and deal on Shabbat. Right? There's different what some people might drive bicycles. The opinions of some. I think one of the opinions of one of the rabbis that some of the rabbis should be driving a bicycle and deal on Shabbat because it's more of a weekday type of activity. That's what I'm not giving any halakha ruling. It's like, rabbis have to know, if you use the pulpit, I always say, a rabbi, you have an opportunity, you have to know how to use it, properly. You know what I'm saying? I don't think it's such at least, I'm mentioning it, you know what I'm saying? People need to, people need to look into the halachic question and ask, as they say, their local Orthodox, their personal. Very interesting.
Yeah, the bench might love it as
All
well.
right, okay, yeah, I'm saying there are rabbi, that's what I'm saying. It depends on you have to talk who your rabbi is, and but that I would think is one of the opinions why you shouldn't be doing it by. But some would say that's what I would understand. One of the other reasons also, Listen, that's much better than people driving cars. Let's understand. For some people, it's a mitzvah for them to ride a bike on Shabbat. You know what I'm saying? Instead of driving cars. It's like I feel that way, with sports, playing ball on Shabbat. For some people, maybe it's better than if you're playing ball on Shabbat. I don't know if I could say it on record, but you understand.
Right.
I'm on record, always on record. Better to be playing ball on Shabbat, playing basketball, than doing some other activity that is.
So doesn't that answer our question?
Hold on 1 second. But for other people, I would say they shouldn't be playing basketball, but they should be doing something, depending where people are. Make sense, that's what I would say. Just like I feel, I'm gonna get a little, some people spend a lot of time focusing on sports and following sports, so many hours. I say, really, maybe there's a time and place. Maybe guys are younger, they need to, they're a little young, they need certain extra outlets and kosher outlets. People get a little older, they get more mature. They got to be focusing their time not on how much time you're spending on watching sports. How much, what's going, you have a mitzvah to learn Torah, you have a mitzvah to chesed, you have a mitzvah to help your parent. I don't know what are you spending so many hours. You have to know. People have to graduate. You have to grow up already. The guy's 30 years old and he's still, half the daily news I remember was on sports. You know what I mean? That's where adults are spending their time. You know what I'm saying? But they're going to be. That's not why when we're not in this world. We want Dr. Moshe to be focusing our attention on all the sports. That we're here, like you're here. You come to learn Torah. You're here. That's what we're supposed to be here. We're not here to do the sports. But again, it's a kosher outlet. Every different people need certain amounts. I think it's way overdone. My humble opinion. You gave me I'm using opportunity to, yes.
No, I'm just saying, doesn't what you just said answer the question about what's doing the lesser two evils, right? In terms of
Right.
Do I save myself from a doraita or do I violate the rabbinic?
Right. So that was the Gemara's question, and at this point, the Gemara. Yeah. So the Gemara said one answer of the Gemara was, "You're right. We'll go ahead and we will not violate the rabbinic law to prevent that Torah law, the unintentional violation of the Torah." And then the Gemara said a different answer, and now the Gemara is saying that the case is different. You can't compare a BV to our case because the Braitas are talking. One case is talking about shogeg, unintentional. One's talking about intentional. And now Rashi's asking the question. So how doesn't that answer that? Why doesn't that prove? If you're telling me shogeg unintentionally, you stuck your hand out with the fruit unintentionally to public property, and we allow you to bring the fruit back in, right? We don't impose a rabbinic prohibition on you. So shouldn't that answer the question by the bread, that we don't impose the rabbinic prohibition of removing it from the oven the same way we allow the guy to bring back the hand? We should say we should allow the guy to take out the bread. So that's what Rashi is trying to address. So Rashi says the reason why they did not give when the guy did it unintentionally, Rashi says, Rashi says because it's not because maybe he's going to throw, meaning when we allow him to bring his hand back in, are we allowing him when he puts his hand out unintentionally? We allow him to bring his hand in. Is it because we are afraid if we're going to go ahead and fine him and say, don't bring your hand back in, he might drop it. And if he drops it, he's going to violate the Torah's prohibition. Is that the reason? Is when we go ahead and we say, we're not going to give him a post. If we tell him to leave your hand out, right? What might happen? He might drop it. And if he drops it, then there's the Torah. You actually did the Torah prohibition. It went from private to public. And therefore, we say, bring the hand back in. We say, no, we tell him, bring your hand back in. And that for sure is going to prevent the possibility. So we're concerned of the Torah prohibition being violated. If you impose a fine and you tell him, leave the hand out, because he might drop it. And therefore, we tell him to bring it back in. So it shows you we're concerned he shouldn't come to a biblical prohibition. And that's why we're allowing him to bring it back in. And so too, you might want to compare the case of the dough in the oven, that you're going to say, you're going to allow him to remove the dough from the wall of the oven in order to prevent that Torah prohibition. Rashi says that they're not comparable. It's 7:26. I have to stay through. We have to go on Monday. Shabbat Shalom. It's a very very complicated points here, and we're getting there. Have a great day.